So I just wanted to give you a really brief overview of some of the major environmental law statutes. There are more than we're going to talk about in this video, but this at least will get you up to speed a little bit about some of the terms and some of the concepts. And you can see there are different regulatory regimes and different regulatory approaches for embedded in different environmental statutes. Come to class with your questions, and we will talk in more detail about some of these statutes. So first of all, here's a quick run through of some of the major statutes. There are more, but this is all that would fit on the slide. So the National Environmental Policy Act is the first environmental statute that was enacted by Congress. It's pronounced NEPA, and it is the cornerstone of environmental analysis for actions. I should tell you what I'm going to do is I'm going to run through each of the statutes here, and then we'll have a slide about each one of them that explains it in a little more detail. So, National Environmental Policy Act, first statute enacted, sweeping in its scope, but also narrow in its scope in very important ways. Clean Air Act, it's called the CAA. Seems pretty obvious, right? It's about what can be emitted into the air. The one interesting thing about all these statutes, right, is they're called Clean Air Act, but it's really about how much pollution can we emit into the air. Same thing for the Clean Water Act, right? It's called the Clean Water Act. It was supposed to give us swimmable, fishable rivers, but what it really does is tell you if you're a polluter how much pollution you can add to the water, and the amount depends on the kind of water body it is. Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA. This is the federal statute that governs the handling of waste, hazardous waste, non-hazardous waste, and how to decide between those two, etc. Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. Nobody ever says that. Everybody says CERCLA or Superfund. This is the Superfund. This statute is about cleaning up contaminated sites that are no longer in operation. So RCRA looks forward. It's about making sure we don't have contaminated sites going forward. CERCLA looks backward at what do we do about the contaminated sites we already have. Toxic Substance Control Act. This controls products, where RCRA deals with waste and CERCLA deals with contamination. TSCA, the Toxic Substance Control Act, deals with products in commerce. The Endangered Species Act is somewhat of an outlier in this list, right? It deals with the natural world rather than products, right? It deals with, everything so far has dealt with pollution, adding pollution to the environment. Endangered Species Act is about protecting threatened and endangered species. Emergency Planning and Community Right to Know Act, EPCRA. This was enacted after the Bhopal disaster in Bhopal, India in 1986. And the most important thing from our perspective in this class is that it created the toxic release inventory that we looked at last class. And so it ensures that information about certain kinds of toxic and chemical releases are publicly available. And then FIFRA, Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act. This governs pesticides and biocides, and it can be extremely important. It's a pretty weak act, but it can be extremely important, for example, for farm workers' safety. Okay, so let's run through the acts that I asked you guys to look at something about for next class. So we'll start with NEPA. This chart explains how you go through a NEPA analysis. The thing about NEPA is it applies to every major federal action. Okay, so you can imagine that there's been a tremendous amount of litigation about what does major mean? What does federal mean? What's an action? The major in general has to do with the amount of money that's spent or whether it makes certain kinds of permanent changes to the environment. Federal, does it have any federal funding? Anything that gets federal funding falls under the scope of NEPA. And I should add that each state also has a state NEPA Act. In New York, it's called SECRA, State Environmental Quality Review Act. How NEPA works is you have a proposed action. And the first thing that the proposer of the action has to decide is it likely to be any kind of a significant impact? That's the first question. right? And the answer to that is either yes, no, or I don't know, right? And there are different paths you take depending on which answer comes to mind. If the answer is no, this is unlikely to have any significant impact, because remember, every major federal action could include spending money to buy toilet paper for the airport. That's a kind of decision, that's a routine decision that NEPA typically doesn't apply to, and there's something called a categorical exclusion. That's over here. You can see listed CE or documented CE. There are some things that are categorically excluded from NEPA, and those are sort of ministerial decisions that are adjacent to operations that affect the environment but don't directly themselves affect the environment, like what kind of toilet paper are we going to buy? So there might be a listed, meaning that there's a categorical exclusion that has already been made and then just gets applied to the situation. But if an agency thinks that it is making a decision that is entitled to a categorical exclusion, it has to document that if it's not a listed exclusion. So you can have a documented categorical exclusion, which the agency says this should be categorically excluded, here's why. And then the agency will make a determination that, in fact, the action is categorically excluded. And that will be a final agency action that is subject to review, as you learned in your PI class. If the answer, on the other hand, to will there be a significant impact is yes, then there's an elaborate process of conducting an environmental impact study. It starts with a notice of intent. And then you have to create a scoping process to scope what it is you're going to study about the environmental impacts. What environmental impacts are you going to study? And what are the options for dealing with them that you're going to study? The scoping process is a public process, and the public can comment on the draft scoping plan. And those comments have to be taken into account in creating the final scoping plan. The final scoping plan, again, tells you now we know what we're going to investigate. And once the investigation is done, they'll create a draft EIS, which is a draft of the environmental impact statement. And again, there's a public comment process. And then a final environmental impact statement is made. Well, all a final environmental impact statement is here's what the impacts are going to be of the proposed action. Here are the possible mitigation measures, etc. Then the agency must produce what's called a record of decision. This is a massive document where they actually decide what they're going to do about those possible impacts. Which option of the many that were considered are they going to select, and how they're going to proceed. And then that becomes a final agency action that is, again, subject to challenge. Now, when you get to the, I don't know, right? We don't know if this is going to be this has significant impacts or not. Some things obviously have significant impacts. Some things obviously don't. And then there's the big area, a very broad area of maybe. So for those kinds of decisions, the agency engages in an environmental assessment, which is an analysis that is way less intense than an EIS. And the conclusion, the goal of the environmental assessment is to decide whether or not there's going to be a significant impact from the proposed action. If the answer is yes, there is going to be a significant impact, or there's the possibility of a significant impact, then it feeds into the draft EIS process we just talked about. If the answer is no, either no, there are no significant impacts, or there are steps the agency can take to ensure that there are no significant environmental impacts, then the agency will issue one of my favorite acronyms, a FONSI, a finding of no significant impact. And that is a final agency action that is subject to review. So that's how NEPA works. NEPA is about assessment before an agency does something. Now, the thing about NEPA that makes it a very frustrating statute to deal with is there's no requirement that the agency avoid negative environmental impacts. The Supreme Court said in a case in the 1980s, Methlo Park, that NEPA prohibits uninformed, not unwise action. So NEPA does not impose substantive requirements, it's wholly procedural.